Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Thanks for taking the time to watch another video. Today we're going to continue talking about a part of slavery that gets least talked about, and that's when it comes to American Indians enslaving each other and helping the Europeans enslave other American Indians. So we're going to continue this great book right here with a lot of good information and sources. The book is called Linking the Histories of Slavery, North America and Its Borderlands. That's your School for Advanced Research Advanced Seminar Series. Edited by Bonnie Martin and James F. Brooks and a lot of contributors. So I'd like to say this is not just what's writing this. A lot of people didn't like my other videos I did recently when it comes to American Indians enslaving each other. They just don't want to believe it. And they said I was just reading Jesuit books, which is not true. I referenced one Jesuit book, and the Jesuit was talking about what he was seeing. You can verify what he's saying and other sources that had nothing to do with Jesuits. We don't focus on Jesuit writings here if that's what you guys think. So dodge your own hijacks. We go through many sources. And it's again, facts over feelings. America is the true old world. Of course, the nations here were doing this to each other. Maybe not the same way in many cases, but they were. So we're going to continue where we left off. In this book last time, we're going to go right into chapter 2. We read chapter 1 already. And chapter 2 is very interesting. It says here, from Westo to Comanche, the role of commercial Indian slaving in the development of colonial North America, by Eric E. Bound. In the last decade, scholars have begun to recognize the central importance of the native slave trade in the development of colonial North America. Much of that scholarship has focused on the eastern woodlands, but some important recent studies have been undertaken regarding the Mississippi West and Southwest borderlands. Understanding the importance of the Indian slave trade is complicated by the fact that legal and moral issues surrounding the activity were interpreted in complex and changing ways throughout the colonial period and across the regions mentioned above. At times, such commerce was legal, and records, though sparse, remain. Indian slavery was often illegal, however, and was, therefore, a clandestine activity that left little direct evidence. Despite this limitation, it has become clear that virtually every native group in colonial North America fell victim to Indian slavers at one time or another. All right? So who's the slaves? Every Indian nation is being enslaved. Okay? They're being taken captive. They all experience that. Even those groups that went on to pursue commercial slaving themselves. Yet today, there have been few attempts to contextualize and analyze Indian slavery on a continental scale. Even though European demand cross-cut regions and colonizing strategies, native slaves were desired in both plantation and non-plantation colonies, all right? In the plantations, who's the slaves? And they were traded within North America in addition to being exported. Again, exported where? Yeah, many other parts of America, but also Africa and Europe. Native polities throughout North America reacted to this demand in remarkably similar ways, despite having come from diverse cultural and political backgrounds and having practiced disparate forms of aboriginal slavery. A number of examples of which are discussed by Catherine Cameron, chapter 1 in this volume. One of those reactions was to pursue slaving as a primary mode of production by developing an economic and military relationship with one or more European colonies, in which indigenous peoples hunted and captured other native peoples who were then exchanged for European manufactured goods, particularly arms and ammunition. All right, you guys hear that? And this is historical truth. No matter how you feel about it, yeah, many indigenous nations sided with certain European groups against their local indigenous enemies. Under certain circumstances, these types of relationships, though often short-lived, had tremendous impact on the shape of colonial history. The intrusion of European commerce into the New World had the ability to transform native polities at great distances from Euro-American beachheads. And the driving force behind such transformations was the influence of this new commercial slaving livelihood. My own research has shown that in the South, this economic strategy developed as a result of a set of circumstances that allowed the Westo Indians to seize almost complete control of the market for several decades during the 17th century, enslaving many indigenous people and trading with Europeans. All right, so real quick, in case you guys don't know, a lot of people don't know about the West. So they're actually, as it says here, an Iroquoian Native American tribe encountered in the southeastern US by Europeans in the 17th century. They probably spoke an Iroquoian language. The Spanish called them people Chichimeco. They called them Chichimeco, not to be confused with the Chichimeca, huh? Sound very similar. And that group's in Mexico. And Virginia colonists may have called the same people Ricahecrian. The first appearance in the historical record is as powerful tribe in colonial Virginia, a powerful tribe. Remember, they were seasoned the slave trade for many decades. They were heavy traders of Indian captives. As it says here, Virginia established a trading relationship with the Westo, exchanging firearms for Indian slaves. When the Westo migrated to the Savannah River, they quickly became known for their military power and their slave raids on other tribes, okay? This is real. All right, so that was just a little bit of history. Let's go back to the book. So again, the Westo, they seized almost complete control of the market for several decades in the 17th century. These circumstances included their own experiences in the beaver wars of the Northeast, Euro-American inexperience with native languages and with the geography of the interior Southeast, privileged access to European arms and ammunition, an easily exploitable resource, Mission Indians in Florida, and so-called pagan Indians along the Spanish frontier, and access to European markets. As I have argued elsewhere, Westo depredations were one of the major factors that led to the formation of a number of native confederacies. Listen, because this was so big, because it was going on so much, so many indigenous people getting taken captive by these groups, that it forced a lot of Indian nations to come together and create confederacies. So this was changing the way of life. This was big, including those of the Yamasee and Creek peoples. Of course, the targets of Westo's slave trade sought the protection afforded by European firearms and were thus forced to participate in the virgin slave trade themselves. As the trade expanded, the Westos could no longer satisfy the European demand for captives, though they attempted to maintain their preeminent position, so they couldn't even keep up. So imagine, guys, how many people are they giving to the Europeans, and the Europeans turning into slaves? And these are Indians. We're not talking about African slaves. I want you guys to pay attention to this. One of the major sources of American slaves was the local American Indians. Apart from the indentured servants and undesirables from Europe, this was one of your main sources, not Africans. And they wanted more and more, and they couldn't keep up with the demand. From the perspective of their English trading partners, the once indispensable Westos had become an obstacle to economic growth. In response, a group of Carolina planters financed a secret war against the group, which was effectively destroyed within 2 years. Without the Westos' interference, Carolina merchants were able to further expand the market in slaves, entangling every native polity in the region as a consequence. Over the next century and a half, as a result of the deadly combination of old world diseases and the slave trade, the social and political diversity of the region plummeted. The only large Confederate groups, such as the Creeks, remained. Was the story of the Westos unique, or simply a local manifestation of a phenomenon that repeated itself everywhere European commerce intruded into Native America? From the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains and Southwest borderlands? Continuing, it says, European colonizing strategies and other important dynamics. Spain was the first European power to establish permanent colonies in North America, founding La Florida in the southeast during the 16th century and New Mexico and Texas in the southwest during the 17th. They followed an age old prescription for empire building, attempted to conquer new lands with armies and turn the inhabitants into Christian peasants through the mission system. Previously in Mexico, the Spaniards had exploited the existing native hierarchical political system in order to control their new imperial subjects, the Aztecs, and they hoped to use the same blueprint for their North American colonies, although they soon discovered that native chiefs in Florida and New Mexico could not exercise the same level of coercive power as the Aztec emperor. Spain was able to create long-lasting relationships with both Mississippian and Puebloan leaders. A recent study discussed further below suggests that despite regularly sending out exploratory parties in the hopes of extending their influence, the Spaniards did not have a tremendous impact on native peoples beyond their colonial settlements and outposts. To be sure, mission Indians contracted Old World diseases throughout the late 16th and early 17th centuries, but it is quite possible that they suffered the brunt of the damage without spreading epidemics to the interior. In the days before the English arrived in La Florida and French influence penetrated the Southwest, interactions between Spanish, Indians, and those of the interior were much less frequent than they would become. Both Mississippians in the South and Pueblos in the Southwest traded with politically and culturally distinct neighbors on a regular but infrequent basis, and European manufactured goods were simply added to the items already exchanged. Some of the new goods were substitutions for aboriginal products, as in the case of glass beads and other items of jewelry. Other items were clear upgrades, for example, metal, hoe blades, axes, and knives. Yet, because the Spaniards did not supply their native allies with firearms or alcohol, none of these goods were truly transformational, with the exception of horses and sheep in the Southwest discussed below, and their availability does not seem to have stimulated market growth. This was due in part to the fact that the Spaniards were less concerned with the Indian trade than with other aspects of their colonial endeavors. In contrast, the French, despite attempting to establish a mission system of their own, were quite interested in developing a commercial exchange with their native host in the Northeast. What began as a way to increase profits on fishing expeditions in the 16th century turned into thriving trade in beaver pelts in the first decade of the 17th. The traders of New France had competition from the Dutch at New Netherlands, as well as from the merchants of New England. All right, so remember, who are these merchants? A lot of these are Sephardic Jews, crypto Jews, people with a lot of money. They're investing and financing in these companies and these trades. And remember, we broke down who were the true founders of the Dutch West India Company. Also includes a lot of Moorish Sephardic Jews as well. Go back to the videos if you haven't checked them out. It says here by 1630, the Dutch West India Company, the Company of New France, and the Massachusetts Bay Company were all in operation. The proximity of multiple European colonies and the economic rivalries between them led to intense interactions among their native allies. These interactions created a context in which diseases could readily spread within and between native groups. New England Indians, the Hurons, and the Five Nations Iroquois all suffered multiple disease outbreaks by mid-century. Meanwhile, the struggle to develop and maintain native trading partners led Europeans to illegally exchange guns and ammunition in an effort to gain or keep Indian alliances. By the mid-1640s, the Mohawks alone were said to possess as many as 400 Dutch firearms. In response, the French began to arm their primary native allies in New France, the Hurons. An arms race also began among New England Indians following the Pequot War of 1636-1637, and 40 years later, the natives were better armed than colonial militias. Coupled with diseases, guns added a frightening new element to the morning war complex. Tremendous loss of life during epidemics prompted survivors to launch raids to capture ever larger numbers of enemies who could be adopted to replace the dead. Those who possessed firearms tended to target groups that had yet to acquire them. The reverberations from this chaotic mix of guns, diseases, and slaving were soon felt throughout all of eastern North America. This is all going on, guys, at the same time. Farther south, the lengthy Atlantic coast between New Netherland and Spanish Florida was claimed entirely by the English, with the exception of a small Swedish settlement along the Delaware River. And again, these are so-called English. Remember, this includes a lot of different people of different ethnic backgrounds coming in as so-called English. But this did not prevent a similarly competitive economic situation from arising. By 1629, a trade had developed between Virginians and Susquehannas in the Chesapeake Bay. That trade was challenged when both Marylanders and Swedes attempted to enter the market in the 1630s, as had occurred in the Northeast. In less than a decade, biting war for the allegiance of native groups led Europeans to begin exchanging guns with Indians. Until mid-century, the Chesapeake was the southernmost European market for firearms. But in the 1650s, a number of entrepreneurs financed explorations of the Piedmont with the intent of further developing the Indian trade. They successfully expanded the market to the south and west in the 1660s and introduced a new product, as well as Indian slaves. Virginia had recently developed tobacco as an export crop, and the economy could not meet labor demands or afford to import sufficient numbers of Africans and indentured servants to hijack. What Africans? Now remember, they're writing this in modern times, and of course they're going to add their African slave trade hijack. But of course, they ain't going to have no sources for the Africans. They'll probably have some for the indentured servants, because we already know that has been debunked. In response, merchants armed their native trading partners with guns and sent them south to capture slaves among groups that did not possess firearms. Again, look how much American Indians are being taken captive and given to Europeans for what? To put in their plantations. And again, what Africans? At the same time, Virginians were developing trade on the southern Piedmont. The French influence was expanding to the west. During the second half of the 17th century, much of the Ohio Valley and the eastern Great Lakes area was abandoned as a result of Iroquois morning wars. You see the Iroquois again. Refugees headed west, where dozens of native groups lived in nucleated villages in present-day Wisconsin under conditions that left them extremely vulnerable to epidemic diseases. The Hurons had been so harried by Iroquois slavers and Old World diseases that their population plummeted, and the Ottawas took over as the primary trading partner of the French. In response to Iroquois aggression, in the 1660s, the French built several missions in the western Great Lakes region that served as trading posts and refugee camps, localities that were particularly important to the development of the Middle Ground. The capture of prisoners who could be exchanged during calumet ceremonies was an integral part of native French alliance building and maintenance, but also served to stimulate the growth of the Indian slave trade. Slaves taken from the Pays as the French referred to the Great Lakes region, including those given to the French during diplomatic exchange, were sent to New France. Some remained there as servants to the colonists, but others were exported to the Caribbean. Okay? That's what I'm trying to tell you. What Africans? They'll call them Africans when they get to the Caribbean, though. But they're American Indians. They're being what? Exported to the Caribbean. And this is what I'm trying to tell you guys. It's other American Indians and undesirable Black Europeans that were sent to the colonies, to the plantations. Not necessarily Africans. English commercial expansion began in earnest with the founding of Carolina in 1670. Carolina was intimately connected with Barbados, one of England's Caribbean colonies, to which it provided timber, beef, and a large percentage of the natives captured by its primary trading partners, the Westos, okay? This is real history. These American Indians captured by other American Indians, the Westos, who are given to the Europeans, who are not necessarily all so-called white, includes many black Europeans, are being sent to the Barbados, and then in history, they're being called Africans or Negros. And they told you they were coming from Africa. They lied to you about that, and they told us in school growing up, and they put it in the textbooks, and we believed it. But I hope that is very clear to you guys after all my slavery videos what was really going on in colonial times. This is more icing on the cake. The desire for unfree labor in the Caribbean was insatiable. However, and by 1680, even as England's Atlantic trade in African slaves expanded, even though they're supposed to be getting all these slaves from Africa, the Westos could no longer meet the continuing demand for Indian slaves to export from Charlestown. All right, does that make sense to you guys? Even though they're supposedly expanding the African slave, they can't even keep up with the demand for Indian slaves. Why? Why would they want more Indian slaves if it was illegal and they're getting all these so-called Africans sent over? Why are they so desperate for more indigenous captives? Think about that. They kind of tell them themselves when they make these statements right here. The Westers couldn't even meet the demand for Indian slaves to export. Over the next 2 decades, therefore, the influence of the commercial slavers, who helped to supply the growing Caribbean labor market, spread across the lower South, pulling every native group into a complex web of interactions that offered new opportunities to some, but threatened the very existence of most. By connecting native groups across wide geographic areas and increasing the frequency of contact between them, the market system created a context in which epidemic diseases could easily spread across the region, in part as a result of depopulation. The search for victims took commercial slavers west to the Mississippi and beyond. After more than 2 decades of exploration in the Mississippi River Valley, the French founded Louisiana on the Gulf Coast in 1699 and soon began to explore the western tributaries of the Great River in the hopes of expanding both their commercial interests and their native alliance network while simultaneously thwarting English westward expansion. Unfortunately for the peoples of the Mississippi River Valley, the Trans-Mississippi West, diseases followed European manufactured goods and commercial slavers into the region, with devastating results. In the more southerly reaches of the continent, France was able to befriend recent victims of English sponsored slave raids, such as the Quapas and the Cadus, who sought military assistance in the form of firearms to protect themselves from slavers. Meanwhile, in the mid-continent, soon after the turn of the 18th century, French guns provided an opportunity for the Osages of the Missouri River Valley to develop a commercial slaving livelihood at the expense of native groups without strong connections to European markets. So they were picking on native peoples who had not allied themselves with Europeans, so they didn't have guns or anything like that. So many different groups of tribes doing this to other tribes, not just the Westos, okay? But now they're telling you, as we went further in the United States, different groups were doing it as well. With the French, as France's Indian allies probed west in search of hides and slaves, they encountered native groups within Spain's sphere of influence and consequently connected Spanish markets in the southwest with English and French markets in the east, adding horses to the already lethal mix of guns and slaving. Horses were introduced to the southwest and southern Great Plains early in the 17th century. We're gonna dodge the hijack big time, because I have a video proving we already had horses here when the Europeans arrived, and horses originated in the Americas, scientifically proven, and went into Asia from here, out of America. At first, access to horses drew diverse native groups to the plains and lessened their dependence on European and indigenous markets. But the introduction of guns from the east and an increased demand for Indian slaves changed the dynamics in the west. Native groups who practiced a mixed hunting and farming economy, because they spent a predictable part of the year gathered around their agricultural fields, became potential victims of slavers. Those groups who were able to obtain both arms and horses fought for control of the market system that now connected the pueblos of the Rio Grande Valley and the horse cultures of the southern plains and the villages of the Red River Valley with New France, Louisiana, and the Atlantic colonies. The Humanos acted as middlemen in a long distance trade before the Spanish arrived in the region. But after the introduction of the horse, they lost their permanent position in the exchange network to Plains Apache groups. In the early decades of the 18th century, however, the Comanches acquired French guns to go with their large horse herds, and they used the combination not only to observe the Apaches but also to develop perhaps the most influential of all commercial slaving society. So the Comanches grew to be very big when it came to enslaving other nations and Europeans. Within the context of these diverse European colonizing strategies and native foreign policies, a number of interwoven dynamics were at play, four of which were extremely important: the development of the Atlantic market system, the introduction of Old World diseases to North America, the dislocation and consequent migrations of scores of native groups, and their coalescence into the new social and political forms. The introduction of guns and horses was transformational and forced groups in contact with those who had acquired these items to use all available efforts to acquire them as well, a fact that forged the political economy of native North America during the colonial period. Old World diseases have long been recognized as having had a tremendous impact on native populations, and recent studies have shown that the more developed a trading network, the more readily epidemic diseases spread between populations. The effects of the market system and diseases caused the dislocation of many native groups and migrations, sometimes across vast distances, were a regular part of the colonial world. Dislocated groups routinely joined with others to form coalescing societies, polities composed of previously unrelated peoples, sometimes speaking different language, you see? So different people were coming together because of this, who formed new social and political institutions, often in new locations. They're talking about American Indians here, in the hopes of maintaining cultural viability. Coalescence was so common, lands, in fact, that the majority of native societies in the 18th century, especially throughout the eastern woodlands and Great Lakes region, were products of this process. Very important right there, guys. A lot of mixing going on amongst different peoples that had to come together by force they felt, and eventually they became like a tribe or a society. The engine that drove these monumental changes was commercial slaving, all because of slaving, a livelihood made possible by a combination of factors at play within the sub-regions of the continent at various times during the colonial period. Okay? Hope you guys enjoying the reading so far. Again, this is history we need to know, and we must learn from it so we don't repeat the same history. I know you guys heard that before. Continuing, it says here, factors that made commercial slavers powerful and influential. A decided military advantage. No matter the region, the commercial slaving strategy could be pursued only under the right set of circumstances. A decided military advantage was absolutely necessary, and the key to such an advantage in the eastern woodlands was privileged access to European firearms, all right, guns. Native groups with such access were almost invariably successful in military campaigns against groups who lacked it, all right, very unfair. Although a bow could fire arrows rapidly and was usable in inclement weather, guns inflicted terrible wounds beyond the abilities of indigenous medical practitioners to treat. The native desire for firearms and ammunition was universal, and in every region of the continent they went to great lengths to obtain them. Native access to firearms was almost invariably the result of multiple European nations vying for control of the Indian trade in the same region, despite laws that commonly forbade the exchange of guns with Indians. As I'm reading this, guys, it just reminds me of modern times, like, how they bring guns into the neighborhoods. There's no gun factories in the inner cities and all that. So who's really bringing in the guns that ends up in the hands of these young men who end up killing each other? It almost sounds like the same story here, just in a different form. Such competition between European powers gave natives access to firearms in the 17th century, and New England, New France, New Netherland, Virginia, Maryland, and Carolina. By the turn of the 18th century, virtually every native group in eastern North America possessed guns, even those that had little or no direct contact with European traders. A fact noted by a number of intrepid explorers. This glut of firearms forced commercial slavers across the Mississippi in search of victims, but in the trans-Mississippi West and the Southwest borderlands, the mobility and power of the horse were additional requirements for military success. Once a military advantage was gained, it had to be maintained by either controlling access to the market in order to keep guns out of the hands of others, or by traveling to areas that did not yet have guns in search of victims. The Five Nations Iroquois blocked their western neighbors' access to English and Dutch markets, and were thereby able to systematically enslave, sell, and adopt thousands of Hurons and others in the 1640s and 1650s. The Westos also maintained a near monopoly on guns, coming out of Carolina between 1674 and 1680, during which time they too captured hundreds, perhaps thousands of Indian slaves. Not the white man. What white man? This happened too. No ifs, ands, or buts. When it was not possible to keep neighbors from acquiring firearms, slavers had to travel, sometimes hundreds of miles, to find groups vulnerable to capture. Englishman Gabriel Arthur spent several months in 1673, 1674 with the Tomahitans and accompanied them when they journeyed from Virginia to Spanish Florida on a slave raid. Once the Illinois acquired guns in 1686, they began raiding south and west against people who did not yet possess firearms. The Chickasaws, too, crossed the Mississippi River before the turn of the 18th century in search of bow and arrow Indians to enslave. They were searching what? For the bow and arrow Indians, the ones who didn't have guns. Man, how is that fair? And how does that make you a warrior? I just want to be real with everybody listening. Is that a true warrior when you go, you have an advantage, you have a gun, and you know you're gonna most likely win? Is that being a true warrior? I guess at the time they did it for survival so they wouldn't be enslaved, but I'm just saying. Continuing, a strategic geo-economic location. Occupying an advantaged geo-economic location was only slightly less important than maintaining a clear military advantage, and often required a migration of some sort in violence to procure and maintain. Although the Mohawks did not have to move to develop a relationship with the traders in New Netherland, they did have to displace the Mohicans, whose villages were located between the Mohawks and the Dutch. The Westos traveled from the shores of Lake Erie to the Virginia back country. That's where they were from. And then onto the Savannah River on the border of present-day Georgia and South Carolina, ostensibly to procure a stable market for arms and Indian slaves. Again, the Westos Iroquois. Henry Woodward, Carolina's principal Indian trader, over the first decade and a half of the colony's existence, encountered a group of Shawnees on the Savannah who had traveled from the Ohio Valley to Spanish Florida and back to Carolina in search of an exchange partner. Similar long-distance migrations also occurred west of the Mississippi River, as evidenced by the Comanches, moved from the New Mexico's far northern frontier to the southern plains, where they violently displaced the Plains Apaches, who had previously dominated trade in the region. Not all economically motivated migrations covered such long distances. The lower Creeks moved from the Apalachicola River Valley to the Ocmulgee in the 1690s to take advantage of a newly built English trading establishment and to put some distance between themselves and their former Spanish allies. The Yamasee traveled an even shorter distance to establish partnership with the English when they moved from the northern frontier of the Spanish mission system to Port Royal when Scots founded a short-lived colony there in 1685. We talking about what Scots, huh? Highlanders, what we talking about? Continuing, it says, an easily exploitable resource. In addition to military and geoeconomic advantages, commercial slavers needed access to an easily exploitable resource. That is to say, native groups that did not possess European arms and ammunition, and by implication lacked European friendship and military support. If possible, traditional enemies were targeted, but the new dynamics of the market system often set strangers upon one another with little cost beyond the need to acquire currency to exchange. That's deep right there, because before, before the Europeans got here, as we read in the previous videos when we were talking about this, the enslavement of the Indians by themselves, they were actually taken captives for many different reasons, mostly enemies though. They weren't really going and just targeting random people. It was usually somebody they had war with. And again, a lot of those captives would become adopted. They would be able to raise their status through kingship if they married in or were adopted in some way to the tribe. But now it's a whole different thing. Europeans are here, and now they're invading other indigenous groups with little cause beyond the need to acquire currency, just for money and survival, but just for money mainly, the root of all evil, right? As the availability of firearms increased in a given region, potential victims were found in the hinterlands or in small, isolated pockets near colonial settlements. Europeans referred to the latter remnant groups by a variety of names, including settlement Indians, Les Petites Nations, praying Indians, and mission Indians, all right? And benefited from their presence in a variety of ways, but could provide them only limited protection from commercial slavers. The Five Nations Iroquois, the most aggressive and successful slavers in the Northeast, again the Iroquois, targeted primarily other Iroquois-speaking peoples during the 1640s and 1650s, but extended their raids into the Ohio Valley and the Pays-de-Haute in the following decades. The mid-Atlantic region beyond the Appalachian Mountains was a potential source of slaves for other groups besides the Five Nations, especially after Virginians expanded their markets to the south and west in the third quarter of the 17th century. The Westos, working with Virginians and later with Carolinians, raided extensively along the northern borders of Spanish Florida, beginning in 1659, and the region remained a favorite target for commercial slavers into the 18th century. As native groups that did not possess firearms became scarcer in the east, slavers began raiding across the Mississippi River, putting people at risk in the northern plains, the large river valleys of the mid-continent, such as the Missouri, Arkansas, and Red, the Gulf Coast, and the southern plains. Continuing, it says, access to markets. Once slaves had been procured, their captors needed access to a market in which to dispose of their goods. Talking about people here, indigenous people, not Africans. Often that market was located within the region, but as the sale of Apache captives to merchants in French Louisiana attest, the slave trade connected vastly divergent areas in real and meaningful ways. Although far from any colonial settlement in the 17th century, the Chickasaws, of northeastern Mississippi were nevertheless positioned to access a number of European markets. To the north and east, the Mississippi River provided a route to the French post of the Pays de Haute and its tributary, the Ohio, led to traders in the mid-Atlantic region. To the south in the lower Mississippi River Valley were potential victims who could be taken to the Caddo traders along the western tributaries of the Mississippi, or east to Indians who had trade connections with Spanish Florida. You see, so if you didn't have a market, if you didn't have a connect, you would bring your captive to the Indians who had the connects or the markets. As you're hearing here, a lot of different nations were in the game. The Chickasaws launched commercial slave raids along all the routes mentioned above. All right, the Chickasaws. Their captives were likely sold at markets in New France, Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico, as well as Charlestown. All right, so where are they being sold? All these places where they had plantations, right? And then what happens? They told us it was Africans they were bringing in. Obtaining access to markets or blocking other groups from attaining such access was a regular and important part of the geo-economic warfare that characterized much of the conflict between native groups in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Mohawk-Mohican War, mentioned above, is a classic example of such conflicts, but similar ones occurred in every region. Indians also attempted to keep European traders from bypassing them to make direct contact with other native groups. When French explorers and traders first encountered the Huapas near the mouth of the Arkansas River, the group was quite receptive to creating an alliance with the European newcomers, but they worked tirelessly to prevent the French from making similar alliances with their neighbors. The Osages were equally adamant about keeping the French from traveling beyond them up the western tributaries of the Mississippi, where they might trade with the Osage enemies. For their part, Europeans also engaged in geo-economic warfare, but with the opposite goal in mind. They wanted to open up access to their markets in order to increase the flow of goods in both directions. Therefore, there was an inherent tension between slavers who were alienating, disturbing, and reducing native peoples and traders who needed stability in large, friendly nations in order to establish and expand commerce. Although European traders certainly benefited from the activities of commercial slavers, especially in the early stages of trade in a particular region, such groups were inevitably seen as a hindrance to market expansion. This tension between slavers and traders often resulted in violent confrontations that played themselves out on a number of levels, from the killing of an individual traders on one hand to trade wars aimed at removing entire nations of native peoples on the other. William Byrd was all too familiar with the former when he reported in 1684 that traders in his employ were killed by the Indians in their return from the westward. About 30 miles beyond the Occaneechi, what great prejudice it is to me, you may guess. They haven't made a very advantageous trading journey. The Westall War of 1680, in which the Goose Creek traders of Carolina essentially destroyed their native trading partners, provides an example of the latter. And continuing, it says here, lack of European military interference. And again, we're in the book linking the histories of slavery, North America and its borderlands, when we're in chapter 2. Europeans were rarely in the position to drastically affect the geopolitics of the market in the 17th century, and their ability to interfere directly with the activities of slavers is an often overlooked but sometimes critically important advantage enjoyed by successful commercial slaving groups. For the first generation or two in any given locale, most European colonists were unable to travel in the uncharted interior beyond their small beachheads without natives willing to act as guides and interpreters, all right? They couldn't go in without your permission. So again, they were allowed to do all this. We allowed them to come in. Obviously, these natives had the ability to take their European guests only where they wanted them to go and communicate to them only the things they wanted them to know. Indian companions were also necessary to keep Europeans safe when they traveled away from the settlements, though some involved in trade still met violent ends. Europeans who failed to follow native diplomatic protocol and who lacked the proper respect for other native customs and rituals often met with dire consequences. They weren't playing that. European impotence in the interior, particularly among the English, was perhaps most directly related to their relative military incompetence in the North American theater of war. In the 17th century, Europeans had not yet adopted the guerrilla style of warfare necessary to succeed in forest combat. Colonial militias generally had poorer quality firearms than Indians, who obtained guns through private traders, and the military presence of Europeans was thin at best. All the factors that made commercial slavers powerful, a decided military advantage, a strategic geoeconomic location, an easily exploitable resource, access to markets, and lack of European military interference were strengthened, weakened, or destroyed on the basis of the changing context created by the complex interplay of European colonizing strategies and native responses. So when the Europeans came in, this is when it got really, really crazy. For example, Spanish policy in Florida forbade arming native allies with guns and encouraged them to congregate at widely spread missions only nominally protected by soldiers. At the same time, the newly developing plantation economies of Virginia and Carolina demanded a significant supply of unfree labor, but neither was yet a significant port of call in the African slave trade. They're straight up letting you guys know that it wasn't even Africans. That wasn't one of the ports where Africans were landed. They're talking about Indians right here. Unfree labor and indentured servitude. That was going on since early, very early times of colonization. But as you guys can see with your own eyes, neither of these places was a significant port for the African slave trade. What Africans? I'm not the one saying it. It's just history when you actually do the research. Meanwhile, the ubiquitous European demand for beaver pelts pitted English, French, and Dutch traders against one another in the Northeast, resulting in a region wide arms race that ultimately saturated the area with firearms. And the ensuing chaotic scramble to secure access to European markets, groups were bounced around the eastern woodlands like pool balls after a break. Some of those groups traveled south with their firearms and used their experiences in the so called Beaver Wars to help them create a successful commercial slaving livelihood hundreds of miles from their traditional homelands. Similar tales can be told about much of North America, and in all regions, the actions of commercial slavers had a tremendous effect on European and native groups alike. Continuing, it says here effects of the actions of commercial slavers provided the impetus behind coalescence. Commercial slavers, more than any other factor, provided the impetus behind coalescence, a phenomenon nearly as ubiquitous in North America as the Indian slave trade. On the one hand, although the reduction of population numbers due to disease has often been noted as a primary factor behind coalescence, disease episodes by themselves did not compel people to join together with other groups until population loss was severe enough to threaten individual or cultural survival. On the other hand, the presence of slavers forced people to congregate for protection, flee the area, or acquire the necessary military presence to dissuade their would be captors. Contemporary accounts of Chickasaw slave raids describe villages stealthily set upon by large numbers of gun wielding warriors who, after killing the adult males, marched scores of captives to slave pens in Chickasaw towns to await exportation. Okay? Real history here. Chickasaw raids and others like them clearly provided a strong incentive to join forces with neighboring groups. As I have argued elsewhere, Only confederated polities managed to pass through the crucible of old world diseases and commercial slaving and remain viable political and military players in the contest for the continent. This is deep what they're saying. Only a couple nations survived this situation, all these things that were going on. Not all groups, however, found it acceptable to throw in their lot with outsiders, cultural and linguistic similarities notwithstanding. So a lot of these groups they're talking about, you don't know about them in history. A lot of them might be classified Cherokee, Blackfoot today. You don't know about these people. Who are these so-called Chickasaw freedmen, Choctaw freedmen, Cherokee freedmen? They're being freed by these tribes. It doesn't always necessarily mean they are from those tribes. They could be from other indigenous groups who were being taken captive. As we're reading here, take for instance a number of groups along the Gulf Coast, including the Acola Pisas, the Bayogulas, the Mugaluchas, and the Taensas, all of whom either joined the groups or allowed other groups to join them, only to violently turn against them when cultural accommodation could not be reached. Groups that clung tenaciously to the idea of their own cultural superiority and refused to join with others often sought alliances with Europeans, alliances that left cultural boundaries more or less intact. Some Southeastern native leaders used their relationships with the Spaniards to bolster their own authority in an attempt to retain traditional, chiefly governance. Moreover, however, small native groups that formed alliances with Europeans were reduced to performing for them a number of tasks for which colonists were initially unsuited, such as hunting, collecting wood and other forest resources, or tracking down and returning runaway slaves. Huh? Who's the slave catchers? Who's the slave catchers? They were using Indians to help them track down and return runaway slaves. Both the former neo traditional and the latter Euro dependent polities were vulnerable to the raids of commercial slavers. However, an untold numbers of their members were captured and sold into slavery. In other words, commercial slavers forced other native groups to decide upon one of a limited number of political strategies and then preyed on those groups that chose wrongly. Okay? Continuing, it says, helped develop markets. Commercial slavers helped develop markets by increasing demand for European products, particularly arms and ammunition. Among their potential victims, during the 17th century in Eastern North America, participation in the slave trade became one of the structural principles of life around which most everything else revolved. Okay? Everything revolved around this. As the slave trade expanded in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the same became true in the trans Mississippi West and Southern Plains and the Southwest. For those without access to European firearms, the prospect of facing Indian warriors who had guns and were intent on carrying away loved ones to be sold into slavery was terrifying. When English colonists arrived on the Carolina coast in 1670, they discovered that the coastal native groups greatly feared the gun-wielding Westos and hoped that by bringing Carolinians meat and dressed deerskin, they would receive protection from the Europeans. Across the continent, similar descriptions and requests were made in reference to the Five Nations Iroquois, Chickasaws, Osages, Apaches, Comanches, and other commercial slavers. These were some of the main nations enslaving other American Indians. Okay, it wasn't just so called white men or Europeans. Most colonial governments attempted to regulate the Indian trade by placing restrictions on exchange, requiring a license to operate, and other measures. Often it was illegal to trade in guns or slaves. Yet the high demand for European arms and ammunition that resulted from the presence of slavers provided the context and opportunity for the development of a thriving black market. Quantifying the exchanges in this market is made difficult by two facts. First, the majority of traders, both legal and illegal, left few written records, despite having been involved in one of the most widespread, all right, the most widespread and lucrative business in colonial North America. It wasn't with African slaves. This is what was most widespread and lucrative. In addition, the worst demographic effects of the slave trade occurred in the hinterlands, away from all but the most intrepid European adventurers. French couriers de bois. All right, here we go. We made a whole video on the cour de bois, the French, how they were really enslaving many American Indians, not just trading fur. Check out that video if you haven't. It's an old school one, but still very relevant. So the French courier de bois and voyageurs traveled the entire length and breadth of the continent, extending French trading interests as they sought personal gain and providing alternative options to native groups without access to permanent European trading posts. Spain and England produced traders and travelers analogous to those of France, who journeyed extensively in the American wilderness and served as vital connection points to European markets for harried native groups made desperate by the presence of commercial slavers. These all but forgotten men played an important role in the expansion of the market by exchanging firearms for furs, pelts, skins, and slaves with any native group, regardless of the intentions of colonial governments or commercial slavers. As potential victims of slavers obtained firearms, their would be captors were forced to extend their raids, and European traders followed in their wakes, developing routes that would soon be crowded with humans. The barter they trucked and a host of microscopic organisms that brought disaster to Indian country. Okay? We're talking about a more historical, real slave trade. Continuing, it says, facilitated the spread of epidemics. Commercial slavers unintentionally helped facilitate the spread of epidemics by stimulating the development of markets and forcing potential captives to live in nucleated settlements where they often suffered from malnourishment and unsanitary conditions. The effects of Old World diseases on native populations of the Southeast during the 16th and 17th centuries, when only the Spanish had colonial presence in the region, seem to have been overstated. Although diseases certainly claimed many lives among mission Indians during that time, it has been argued that disease epidemics did not severely affect native groups in the interior before the development of a widespread trade network. It has generally been assumed that the dramatic decrease in native population in the South between 1685 and 1715 was epidemiological in nature. But this period also represents the height of Indian slave trade in the region. You see, that's a big one right here, guys. Hope you guys understand. And a lot of you know what they're talking about. They try to say, oh, they all died from disease, they all went extinct. No, a lot of them went into slavery, went into these plantations, and were reclassified as so called Negroes or Africans. They generalized on the epidemic part and left out the whole slavery thing. Again, because this period represents the height of the Indian slave trade in the region, the height which contributed significantly to the demographic decline. All right, that's why all of a sudden you're talking about, oh, they went extinct, or they all died from disease. Stop lying. A lot of these people ended up in the plantations. A lot of these people ended up as slaves. That's what led to a significant demographic decline, in part because European commercial interests exacerbated indigenous practices related to the capture of enemies. The first major recorded outbreak of smallpox in the region did not begin until 1696 in Virginia. It quickly spread from the mid-Atlantic region into the southeast, eventually reaching the Mississippi River Valley and traveling south to the Gulf Coast and north to the Ohio Valley. Aftershocks followed on the heels of the great southeastern smallpox epidemic, and indigenous peoples suffered the worst biological consequences of colonialism, as the deadly synergism of Columbian exchange diseases, aboriginal germs, and malnourishment took a truly horrific toll, okay? And there's sources for this. This is real history. In the Northeast, the barriers that kept diseases from spreading in the interior were broken down earlier, but were also likely introduced along trade routes. The Five Nations Iroquois faced epidemics regularly during the middle decades of the 17th century, including during the years 1633, 1640, 1641, 1647, 1656, 1657, 1661, 1663, 1668, 1673, and 1676. They had it a lot of times. In response to these disease outbreaks, the Five Nations almost invariably launched raids designed, at least in part, to procure captives for adoption. By the end of the 17th century, the Iroquois had captured thousands of people, some of whom passed into the hands of others, but many of whom eventually became accepted as citizens of the Five Nations, and they weren't even Iroquois, you see? But remember, we read this, a lot of the times they were adopted into the tribe, and mainly because they needed to replenish their people, and they did it with captives. Those who escaped Iroquois raids were forced to join with other refugees and seek access to firearms and ammunition or risk falling prey to new assaults. In other words, throughout eastern North America, a positive feedback loop existed between disease, epidemics, and slave raids that heightened native vulnerability to both. As these twin hammers battered North America, Indian populations were pushed and pulled across the continent by a growing vortex of violence and uncertainty. All right? These were very rough and crazy times for the ancestors. Continuing, it says here, forced the migration of scores of populations. Scores of populations were forced to migrate, sometimes repeatedly in response to fluctuations in the market, the change in fortunes of particular commercial slaving groups, the movement of other native populations, and a host of other factors equally beyond their control. Commercial slavers provided an important push factor for this movement, since one strategy for avoiding enslavement was to migrate outside the range of the slavers. The Quapas appear to have left the original home in the Ohio Valley, all right, they were a Siouan tribe, sometime during the 17th century, as a result of recurrent raids against them by Five Nations, by the Iroquois groups, armed with Dutch guns from New Netherland. The Quapas ended up near the mouth of the Arkansas River, where they encountered the French in 1673, whom they soon solicited for firearms to protect them from Chickasaw slaving expeditions. Now they got to deal with the Chickasaw. European settlements served as pull factors in migration because they offered the possibility of market access. The Comanches, after acquiring horses and transforming their culture as a result, migrated onto the southern plains, where they began an aggressive campaign to oust the Apache groups already living there in order to gain access to both Spanish and French markets. In addition to the possibility of exchange, European settlements offered the promise of protection from commercial slavers, and many groups that moved as a result of slave raids sought new homes near colonial outposts or towns. The French post in the Pays des Hauts became multicultural, polyglot communities composed of myriad groups attempting to avoid becoming slaves, while at the same time acquiring the means, guns, to enslave others. The Westos successfully followed such a strategy when they fled their home near Lake Erie as a response to the Iroquois' aggression and migrated to Virginia, where they were able to gain access to a source of arms and ammunition. So they were being oppressed like that, and then they went to Virginia and started doing it themselves to other groups. Continuing, it says, increase the level of hostile interactions. Competition to obtain firearms and slaves increased the level of hostile interactions between native groups and hindered the creation of Indian alliances. Slave raids were acts of war and required retaliation, regardless of political and economic consequences. Whenever possible, the targets of slave raids were chosen in accord with cultural as well as political and economic imperatives. That is to say, Slave raids were often launched against old enemies, as when the Five Nations targeted various northern Iroquois speakers who might be more readily adopted by their captors. Yet the realities of the exchange system regularly conspired to help create new enemies, as when the Savannah Indians turned on their erstwhile friends, the Westos, in an attempt to become the permanent trading partners of Carolina's Goose Creek men. Sometimes, as in the case of the Savannahs and the Westos, conflicts between Indian groups served colonial purposes by increasing market demand. In fact, European traders in every region were at times accused of fomenting war to increase their profits. Other times, however, these enmities ran counter to European desires and imperial plans. The Great Peace of Montreal, negotiated by the French in 1701, was an amazing feat of diplomacy, considering that in order to reach an agreement, the Five Nations, on one hand, and a number of Algonquin speaking groups on the other, had to put aside bad feelings resulting from generations of endemic violence. The peace accord provided for an exchange of prisoners taken in previous raids, but ironically, also required the participants in Montreal to capture new slaves from groups not represented at the treaty negotiations, which they could exchange among themselves. You hear that? As signs of friendship and alliance. No matter peace or war, slaving was a widespread and persistent activity in colonial North America, but such a disruptive force could not be sustained indefinitely. Continuing, the decline of the Indian slave trade and commercial slaving, decline in supply of potential captives. A number of factors converged in the 18th century to decrease the overall traffic in Indian slaves, even though they continued to be exploited in North America into the 1800s. The positive feedback loop between diseases and slaving severely diminished the supply of potential captives. In the Northeast, epidemics and Iroquois raids combined to create a vacant quarter from the Ohio River north to the Great Lakes. All right, they had depleted the area. In the South, within 50 years of the founding of Carolina, the century-and-a-half old Spanish mission system was effectively destroyed. Remember, the Spanish were there first. We have videos on that. And much of the population of the peninsula of Florida had already been enslaved. Within 30 years of the establishment of the French Louisiana, virtually all the native people of lower Mississippi River Valley had been reduced to remnant groups of refugees known as Les Petites Nations. This is what's going on, God. Epidemics and commercial slavery took their toll west of the Mississippi, spreading up its western tributaries and claiming new victims, while simultaneously stimulating the expansion of trade networks and inflaming competition between France, Spain, and their respective Indian allies and exchange partners. Whether the potential victims of commercial slavers attempted to congregate for protection or to flee an area for safety, they were forced to seek access to firearms to ensure their continuing liberty. Okay? Real history, and it devastated North America. Increased availability of guns. Slaves were the currency generally exchanged for arms and ammunition. So, as the market for Indian captives increased, the availability of guns increased as well. Whenever a group of sufficient population that had previously been victimized by commercial slavers was able to obtain access to firearms, it stood a chance of changing its fortunes. After having been battered back and forth between Iroquois and Sioux raiders from the east and west, respectively, the Ottawas were able to step into the breach left by the Huron diaspora and become major trading partners of the French. Similarly, the Osages turned their access to French firearms into a commercial slaving livelihood, but only after they had been forced west from the Ohio Valley area. Later, the Gihasuan cousins, the Quapas. In the southeast, in part as a result of falling victim to slave raids, the Lower Creek peoples ended their alliance with the Spanish who knew them as Apalachicolas, concluded a peace between themselves and the Westos, with Henry Woodward acting as mediator, and moved to the Ocmulgee River to obtain English firearms. The Yamasee Indian polity was composed of the remnants of several native peoples from present-day central Georgia, right? Remnants of different peoples from central Georgia. This is what the Yamasee Indian polity was. And the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina. So you see the connection with the Creeks people, right? Muskegon speaking people, so-called Creek, that's not their real names, right? Who were forced to coalesce and seek an alliance with Spain in response to Virginia-sponsored slave raids. When a chance came in 1684 to instead align themselves with the English, the Yamasee took the opportunity, received guns from their new trading partners, and changed their status from captive to captor virtually overnight. As more and more groups obtained arms and ammunition, the supply of vulnerable potential victims decreased. Continuing, it says, increased European military interference. While the effects of diseases and slave raids combined with the availability of guns to increase the difficulty of locating suitable captives, colonists also began to impinge more direct upon the affairs of their native neighbors. The experiences gained in the interior of the continent by European traders in the preceding decades better equipped them to bypass native blockades, decipher Indian intentions and actions, and understand and manipulate the politics of exchange. Europeans throughout North America had also become more potent militarily, partly as a result of an increased ability to travel and communicate without absolute dependence on native guides and interpreters, but also because they adopted the forest combat strategies of the Indians. Along the eastern seaboard, an ever growing colonial population posed perhaps the biggest threat to native societies, increasing potential exposure to lethal microbes, intensifying the contest for possession of the continent, and adding demand for Indian captives. Now every group, even those with sufficient arms and ammunition, feared enslavement, just as it had been in the Pause de Haute before the Great Peace of Montreal. The situation in the Southeast had become untenable. All right, so nobody's safe now. The Europeans always took it a little further. The plantation economies of the mid Atlantic and lower South were the biggest consumers of Indian slaves outside of the Caribbean and provided the largest markets for their exportation. Okay, this is real history. So they're talking about it's either Indians or people coming from the Caribbean. So now you got to prove that all these people from the Caribbean are African. Show me the slave ships coming from Africa. A lot of those are also Indians, and many of those also black Europeans. Let's not forget about the indentured servants that were sent to the Caribbean islands. I got whole books on it. As you guys can see, they didn't say nothing about Africans. So apart from the Caribbeans coming up, right? Indian slaves from North America, what was supplying these plantation economies and providing a market for their exportation. When they're saying that they're replenishing the slaves, the Indian slaves, because they all died with Africans, no, they're sending more Indians from North America and other places. Here it's telling you right here, largest markets for their exportation. In the mid 17th century, as the market for Indian captives developed in these regions, small commercial slaving groups became powerful, but a number of other strategies, the neo traditional, Euro dependent, and confederated approaches were pursued by native groups as well. As the trade expanded, however, slaving became essential to survival, and followers of other strategies soon became slaves. Eventually, even commercial slaving groups with small populations like the Westos and the Tuscaroras became vulnerable to enslavement, a situation that ultimately resulted in the Yamasee. That is the origin of the Yamasee Wars, in case you guys didn't know. After 3 decades as commercial slavers, the Yamasees rightly feared that they would soon be enslaved by their former trading partners, the Carolinians. and they killed the traders and officials visiting them on April 15, 1715, igniting an epidemic of violence against the English that spread along the same trading paths as the diseases that had ravaged native groups. Every major Indian trading partner of the English murdered traders living among them in the weeks following the Yamasee's initial attack, and their combined efforts exacted a terrible toll in English lives, forcing the English to reevaluate their economic policies regarding native slavery. All right, so now be ready to dodge the hijack, guys. All right, they're going to start talking about so called Africans. You know, they got to add that in. This is a modern book. Let's see what they're saying. It says here expanded markets for African slaves. After the Yamasee War, the primary markets for Indian slaves in the mid Atlantic and southeastern regions of the continent dried up. At the same time, the markets for Africans who were universally preferred over natives or indentured Europeans as chattel slaves were expanding. There you go. And as you guys can see, there is no footnote on this part. They had footnotes on a lot of parts. Do you see? No footnotes. What Africans? There you go. No Africans. They can't prove that. Yeah, you see what they're telling you though. Indentured Europeans as chattel. Again, here, indentured Europeans as chattel slaves were expanding. They were just replacing Indians with other Indians from other parts of America, which they're classifying as Africans, or indentured Europeans as chattel slaves. That's the real history. The plantation economies of Virginia and the Carolinas had somewhat stabilized. I knew they weren't really going to prove anything, and I'm glad you guys can see there is no footnote for that part. The plantation economies of Virginia and the Carolinas had somewhat stabilized, and in the hopes of expanding the system, the English turned their focus toward expelling their French and Spanish rivals from the South. As this imperial contest in the East heated up, native allies became much more important as military auxiliaries than as producers for the market, and therefore colonial officials could not afford to allow the effects of the slave trade to alienate potential Indian allies. Native societies that had been able to maintain large populations, either because of comparative geographic isolation, as in the cases of the Cherokees and Choctaws, or through the incorporation of refugee groups and adoption of captives, as in the cases of the Creeks and Five Nations Iroquois, were able to survive the era of commercial slaving in the East to become important political and military players in the European contest for the continent. And that's the reason you don't know anybody else. They didn't survive these commercial slave raids and epidemics. And again, a lot of these nations that survived were a part of that. As a result of new demographic realities among native societies and new political goals of European empire, the Indian slave trade declined east of the Mississippi after the first couple of decades of the 18th century, quelling to a certain degree the unprecedented loss of social and cultural diversity that had resulted in great part from the practice. Okay? That's what it caused. That's a big one too. It's unfortunate. And continuing, it says here, conclusion. All right, we're almost at the end of the chapter. It says here, Spanish markets in Texas and New Mexico and French markets in the Pays de Haute and Louisiana together created enough demand for native captives to maintain commercial slaving as a viable strategy, not only in the trans-Mississippi West, Southern Plains, and Southwest, but even as far west as Alta California. The captive and livestock trade network, of which are discussed in detail by Natalie Sapia in Chapter 5 in this volume. Additionally, the factors that made slavers powerful were still in operation in the West. A true military advantage could be maintained in the region by coupling possession of large horse herds with access to European firearms and ammunition, which were still available only in limited numbers. Unlike in the East, those who were able to acquire both horses and guns found a number of easily exploitable targets from the river valleys of the western tributaries of the Mississippi across the northern and southern plains and onto the Great Basin and the Pueblo communities in the Rio Grande Valley, as well as their pastoral neighbors, the Navajos. Good geoeconomic locations with access to multiple European markets could still be controlled by native groups, which ensured that there was always a place to exchange their goods, no matter the political climate in Europe. In the West, there were far fewer Spanish, French, and English colonists than there were east of the Mississippi. Their outposts were widely scattered and only nominally protected, and the most essential items necessary for pursuing a raiding lifestyle, horses, could not be kept from natives by Europeans in the same way powder and shot could be withheld. After having completely altered their way of life during the 16th and 17th centuries by developing a dependence on the European introduced horse, the Comanches decided to migrate from the northern frontier of Spanish New Mexico to the heart of the southern plains, where they obtained access to European markets through which horses, native captives, and firearms could all be exchanged. Beginning at the turn of the 18th century, when the Indian slave trade in the East was reaching its violent crescendo, the Comanches used the above mentioned advantages to break into and ultimately dominate the trade in captives on the southern plains by mid century, in the process displacing and in some cases enslaving Plains Apache groups whose diaspora from Apacheria between the 17th and 19th centuries is traced by Paul Conrad, chapter 3 in this volume, and that's a very good chapter. You guys are going to see where they ended up. We're going to get that in a future video. Between approximately 1750 and 1850, the Comanches used their permanent place in the regional exchange system to create an empire and become, as some scholars have put it, lords of the South Plains. They were able to forestall attempts by Europeans and Americans to oust them or in any way gain control of Comanche lands, at the same time plundering colonial resources virtually at will. They kept their population high by willingly incorporating large numbers of foreign native groups and were able, for more than a century, to maintain the advantages that allowed them to develop a hegemonic influence over the other polities in the region, both Indian and European. Like the Westos and other commercial slaving groups before them, the Comanches had a tremendous but little recognized role in determining the political, economic, and military development of the colonial world. For more than 200 years, such groups arose whether the interplay of European colonizing strategies and native responses provided the opportunity. By exploiting European inexperience and their own military and geoeconomic advantages, commercial slaving groups provided a major impetus for social and political coalescence, facilitated the spread of disease as they expanded the market, and increased the level of hostile interactions between native and European groups. Everywhere this strategy was implemented, a positive feedback loop between slaving and the spread of disease developed, the availability of firearms increased dramatically, and the search for victims sent slavers into colonial hinterlands. Although the influence of particular commercial slaving polities was often short-lived, and the demographic effects of their raids were less severe than those related to European introduced diseases, the consequences of their actions reverberated throughout colonial history. The further study of these groups promises to enrich and unite our understanding of the histories of slavery in North America. All right, so that was a very deep chapter. I enjoyed the information. I hope you guys enjoyed it. A lot of good info. And it's true what he's saying here at the end. If you want to really understand the histories of slavery in North America, you got to understand this part. Here at the bottom, it shows some of the notes. Again, some of the sources. You know, I had a lot of footnotes. And I want to emphasize again, they didn't have no footnote when they were talking about the African thing. I just wanted you guys to know that. And even when you go throughout all these sources, you're not going to find a slave ship coming from Africa. So again, this was chapter 2, From Westo to Comanche, the Role of Commercial Indian Slavery in the Development of Colonial North America. That was such a deep topic. Again, that was the book, Linking the Histories of Slavery, North America and Its Borderlands. Hope you guys enjoyed the reading. Again, this is nothing personal. People that may find this offensive because they're from the Chickasaw or the Westos or anything like that. Whatever happened in the past happened. That has nothing to do with you. Your ancestors did what they had to do, surviving many times. And again, many nations were part of capturing each other, not just these main ones. So don't take it personal. And understanding that there was a major local slave trade that can be researched and is historical will open your eyes to see a more real slave trade. Without your own hijacks, this is beyond beliefs. These are facts, information you can verify. Hope you guys enjoyed this series, The Real Slave Trade. I'm definitely going to have more parts. Thanks once again for taking the time to go ahead and watch the video. Shout out to everybody in the chat who was live. Thanks to all the patrons for the support. Shout out to the Telegram back chat. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Awa.